At 73 years old, George Strait finally said something he spent decades avoiding. Not about charts, not about awards, not even about himself. This time, it was about Toby Keith, and that alone should make you stop. Because George Strait is the kind of man who lets silence do the talking. No headlines, no drama, no explanations. So, when he finally opened up, people knew this was different. These weren't polished words. They weren't planned. They came from a place George rarely lets the world see. And here's the part no one expected. What George revealed wasn't about music, it wasn't even about fame. It was about a moment, a decision, and something Toby did that changed how George saw him forever. But that's not all, because the timing of this confession matters. George didn't speak when Toby was everywhere. He didn't speak when it was safe. He waited until the weight of silence became heavier than the truth. And when he finally broke it, the story behind it was deeper, quieter, and more emotional than anyone imagined. Stay with me. Because once you hear what connected these two legends behind closed doors, you'll never look at either of them the same way again. George Strait and Toby Keith lived in the same world, but they didn't walk the same path. George was the quiet force, measured, controlled, almost untouchable. A man who never needed to explain himself. Toby was the opposite, loud, unfiltered, unapologetic. He walked into rooms like he owned the air inside them. From the outside, people assumed there was tension. Two giants, two egos, two completely different versions of country music. But that assumption was wrong. There was no feud, no bad blood, just distance. George didn't chase friendships in the industry. He didn't linger backstage. He didn't play politics. And Toby? Toby played by his own rules. If something needed to be said, he said it. If it made people uncomfortable, even better. That contrast alone made people believe they couldn't possibly understand each other. But listen to this. George never mocked Toby's volume. He never rolled his eyes at the controversy. He watched quietly. And he noticed things others didn't. Like how Toby never pretended, never softened his edges, never asked permission. George respected that, even if he'd never say it out loud. They crossed paths over the years. Award shows, benefits, industry events, short handshakes, quick nods. Nothing dramatic. Yet every time, George walked away with the same thought. That man is real. And coming from George Strait, that's not a casual observation, that's a statement. But the truth is, respect alone wasn't enough to make George speak. Something else had to happen. Something unexpected. Something powerful enough to stop a man like George Strait in his tracks. And when that moment came, it didn't happen on a stage. It happened on a road. But listen to this. Because what George heard next changed everything. It wasn't backstage. It wasn't a handshake. It wasn't even a conversation. The moment that changed everything for George Strait came through a speaker. Picture it. A long Texas drive. Miles of road. That familiar quiet George always lived inside. Then the radio shifts, and Toby Keith comes on. Not with a love song. Not with something safe. But with something that sounded like raw nerve. Turned into music. The kind of track that doesn't just play. It demands your attention. George heard it. And it didn't feel like entertainment. It felt like a message. Like somebody finally said out loud what millions were carrying in their chest. And that's what shook him. Because George Strait is patriotic too. But he's careful. Traditional. He doesn't wave it in front of cameras. He doesn't turn it into a headline. Toby did the opposite. Toby went straight into the fire. No fear, no softening the edges, no worrying about who would get mad. And George realized something in that moment. This isn't just a loud guy with a guitar. This is a man willing to take the heat, so other people don't have to. But that's not all. Because the real twist isn't the song. It's what George did right after hearing it. He didn't tell the press. He didn't mention it in an interview. He didn't even hint at it. He reached for the phone. And for a man like George Strait, that's basically a confession, a quiet one, but a big one. He called Toby, not to chat, not to joke around, just a few words. The kind of words George doesn't give easily. And those words hit Toby harder than any trophy ever could. But listen to this. Because that phone call became the start of something nobody saw coming. And what Toby said later proved George's respect wasn't temporary. It was permanent. That phone call never made the news. No headline. No quote pulled out of context. Because George Strait doesn't make calls for attention. He makes them when they mean something, Toby answered, expecting small talk. Maybe a quick hello. Maybe nothing at all. Instead, George got straight to it. No build-up, no praise-filled speech, just honesty. He told Toby the song didn't just land, it hit hard. George said it spoke for people who didn't know how to say those words themselves, people who felt it but couldn't explain it. And for a second, the loudest man in country music went quiet. Because praise from George Strait isn't casual, it's rare, it's earned. That call meant more to Toby than awards, charts, or sold-out shows. He told people later that it stayed with him, that it came from the one man who never said things just to be polite, but listened closely. What mattered most wasn't what George said, it was what he didn't say. No advice, no warnings, no be careful. Just respect. That's when Toby knew something. George wasn't watching him like an industry peer. He was watching him like a man measuring another man's backbone, and from that moment on, George stopped seeing Toby as noise. He saw him as courage. But that respect came with a realization George didn't expect. Because as much as he admired Toby's fearlessness, there was a part of it George didn't have, and that truth sat with him longer than the call itself. It made him think, it made him question, and it made him notice something darker. Because the same boldness that made Toby powerful was also making him a target, and that's when things started getting complicated. Because while George stayed quiet, the industry didn't, and what they did next pushed Toby into a fight nobody was prepared for. But wait, because it gets worse. What George saw coming was something Toby could never outrun. The industry never knew what to do with Toby Keith. He was too loud, too honest, too hard to control. Executives whispered. Critics scoffed. Accusations surfaced, not legal ones, but cultural ones. They said he was reckless. They said he was divisive. They said he didn't fit the new direction. George Strait saw all of it, and he saw something else most people missed. Toby didn't fight back with statements. He didn't soften his tone. He didn't explain himself. He just kept showing up. That takes a different kind of strength, the kind that doesn't ask to be understood. George had spent his career avoiding that fight. Not out of fear, out of discipline. He knew how the machine worked, and he knew when to stay silent. But watching Toby take hit after hit, George felt something uncomfortable. Admiration mixed with guilt. Because Toby was saying out loud what George chose to carry quietly, and it was costing him. Radio cooled off. Industry doors closed a little faster. Smiles became tighter. Still, Toby never flinched. George noticed how other artists began keeping distance, how praise suddenly came with disclaimers, how loyalty became conditional. And that's when George understood something important. This wasn't about music anymore. It was about backbone. Toby wasn't being punished for what he sang. He was being punished for refusing to bend. George said nothing publicly, but privately, his respect deepened. Because when the noise gets loud and the room turns cold, that's when you find out who someone really is. But listen to this. The pressure wasn't the hardest part for Toby. Something else was coming. Something no amount of toughness could block. And when George finally noticed it, he realized the clock was already ticking. And that's when everything changed. Toby Keith never let the cracks show. That was the rule. Smile first, joke louder, walk in like nothing could touch you. So when whispers started, most people ignored them. Weight loss, canceled appearances, longer gaps between shows. The public brushed it off. Toby's just slowing down. Toby's fine. George Strait knew better. Because George watches what others miss. He notices the eyes, the pauses, the way a man stands when his body isn't cooperating anymore. They crossed paths at a quiet charity event in Texas. No cameras pushing in, no crowd noise to hide behind. Toby still had the swagger, the walk, the grin, but George saw it. Something was off. They didn't talk long. They never did. Just a handshake, a look, and a sentence Toby dropped like it was nothing. Still got songs to sing. That line stayed with George. Because that wasn't confidence. That was defiance. Toby wasn't pretending nothing was wrong. He was choosing not to surrender to it. Behind the scenes, the fight was already there. Quiet, relentless, unforgiving. And Toby kept showing up anyway. Not for headlines, not for sympathy, for the fans. George understood that kind of stubbornness. That refusal to let pain write the ending. But here's the part that hit him hardest. Most people didn't know. And Toby wanted it that way. No dramatic announcements, no public struggle, just a man caring more than anyone realized. And George started to feel it, that pressure in the chest that comes when you know time is slipping. And words left unsaid start piling up, because George knew something then. If he waited too long, he might never get the chance. And that realization pushed him to do something he almost never does. He spoke before it was too late. But listen carefully, because what he chose to say next meant everything. George Strait never believed in waiting for the right moment, because in his worldview, the right moment usually comes too late. He'd seen it before. Artists praised after they're gone, words finally spoken when they can't be heard. George didn't want that ending, so he did something quiet, something deliberate, something that would never trend. He reached out again. No public statement, no tribute song yet. Just truth, delivered directly. George told Toby what he meant to the music. Not the sales, not the image, the spine. He told him the industry needed people who didn't ask permission. People who took the hits and kept standing. People like him. Toby listened. And this time, the call didn't end quickly. Because hearing that kind of respect from that man changes how you carry the fight. Later, Toby told a close friend something that never made the headlines. He said George Strait calling him the real deal meant more than any award he'd ever won. Think about that. A man known for thunder, finding peace in a quiet voice. George didn't wait for a stage. He didn't wait for permission. He said it when it could still be felt. And when Toby's strength finally gave way, George didn't regret silence, because he had already said what mattered. But here's the part that still haunts him. Saying it didn't make losing him easier. In fact, it made it heavier. Because once Toby was gone, George realized something chilling. The noise was fading. The bold voices were disappearing. And suddenly, the quiet man was standing closer to the front line than he ever planned. And that's when George changed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. And in the end, that change became Toby's final mark on him. George Strait never set out to become the last man standing. He just stayed true, stayed steady, stayed silent when silence felt safer. But Toby Keith didn't live that way. Toby burned loud. He spoke when it cost him. He stood when sitting would have been easier. And somehow, those two paths crossed at exactly the right time. George didn't honor Toby with noise. He honored him with action, with private words, with respect given before it was too late. That's the part people miss. Because legacy isn't built at funerals. It's built in moments when no one's watching. And now, at 73, George carries something new. Not regret, responsibility. The responsibility to protect what Toby fought for. Honesty, backbone, real country music. One man rode with thunder, the other rode with silence, but they held the same line. And here's the question that lingers long after the music fades. Who's willing to stand like that now? If this story changed the way you see George Strait or Toby Keith, leave a comment and tell me what moment hit you the hardest. And if you believe real stories still matter, subscribe. Because some legends don't fade, they echo.